Welcome back, friends. Dan Vega here, your friendly neighborhood Spring developer advocate, and today we're going to the clouds. We're going to Spring Cloud, that is. And what is Spring Cloud? Spring Cloud is a set of tools that allows developers to build some of the common patterns you'll find in distributed systems like configuration management, service discovery, circuit breakers, and more. While we're in the cloud today, we're going to take a look at Spring Cloud Gateway. Now, what is an API gateway? Why should I care about one, Dan? And what is Spring Cloud Gateway going to offer me? These are all questions that we'll try and answer in this introduction to Spring Cloud Gateway. Now, you may have never heard of a gateway. You may have never even thought that you needed one. That is kind of the point of this video. That is why my friend Nate Schuda and I have been doing a talk called Spring Recipes. I will go ahead and leave a link to that in the description below. And really the point of this is the Spring ecosystem is so massive. Oftentimes you'll come across problems and you won't know that there's a solution for it in Spring. So part of our job is just making you aware of some of the solutions out there. And I think that's one thing I really want to accomplish today is making you aware of what Spring Cloud Gateway is, what problems it will solve for the next time that you run into the situation, you know which tool to reach for. With that, I want to take a little bit of a diagram before we jump into some code, just to talk about what we're going to go through today. All right, so here I am in Excalidraw. I know everybody always asks me where I come up with these drawings for. I'm not great at art, but this is a really great tool that helps me kind of put these together. So I'll try and share this graphic out as well. We're going to talk about first, what is an API gateway? So an API gateway is really a single point of entry for all of our backend services. This could be our distributed architecture. We could have a bunch of backend services. I don't want to say just microservices because they don't need to be microservices. Any services that we want to put behind a gateway, that's fine. So we could have a bunch of services behind here. Also, there is a situation where you might want to put a monolith behind a gateway as you start to deconstruct a monolith into different services. This is a great use case for an API gateway. It's all about manipulating the request before it goes off to the proxied service and then manipulating the response before you send it back to the client. So that is one kind of function of a gateway. The other big one is cross-cutting concerns. We have all of these different backend services. We don't want to do all of the cross-cutting concerns in all of the applications. We kind of want to have one place to do them. Things like authentication and security, load balancing and circuit breaking, observability when we're talking about logging, monitoring, distributed metrics, service discovery, and caching. So that at a high level is what an API gateway is. We'll talk about Spring Cloud Gateway and what that offers in a second, but I want to talk about the service we're kind of building out today. So I've been doing this in some recent videos, and we're kind of continuing this trend here. There's a JSON placeholder service out there, pretty cool service. I'm kind of replicating that to kind of show off some of this stuff. We're calling it Danson's placeholder service. And what we're going to do today is we have all these different microservices. I built out 2 of them so far, which is posts and comments. And these are going to, instead of having all these clients like figure out where to call these different services, we're going to put this gateway in front of them. So now the clients have a single point of entry. They call the gateway will route traffic down to the different microservices. And you get a lot of benefits out of this, things that we just talked about in the previous image. But also, now that it's behind a gateway, they don't all need to be written in Spring. If you have a bunch of different teams in your organization, maybe you have some Python developers or some Go developers, these services could be written in different languages. And then we have some cross-cutting concerns here that we can solve for in Spring, things like configuration, service registry, and circuit breaking. And ultimately, we're going to push out posts and comments in our gateway to containers, and we can deploy them somewhere. We're not going to do that in this video, but we could do that. So that's the service. That's the API gateway. What does Spring Cloud Gateway give us? So Spring Cloud Gateway, built on Spring Framework 5, Project Reactor, and Spring Boot 2.0. There's an asterisk there because in a future video, we'll take a look at a new project that brings Spring MVC to Spring Cloud Gateway. Right now, if you need to write any kind of code in there, it's based on Webflux, so we're going to use that kind of reactive style, which is good because, again, if we're building out a gateway that is really just passing requests on to other services, we don't want that to be blocking, right? So features are I'm able to match routes on any requests. I have predicates and filters. We'll see what that means in a second. Circuit breaker integration, discovery client integration, easy to write predicate and filters, rate limiting. So if you wanted to have that API, that gateway sitting in front of services and limit the amount that certain clients can call in, you can do that. You can also rewrite paths. Here's a representation of one of the graphics in the documentation. What we're doing here is what is this? What happens in a Spring Cloud gateway request? So first, a client makes a request to the Spring Cloud gateway. If the gateway handler mapping determines that a request matches a route, so we figure out like, hey, does it match something? It does. Let's send it to the gateway web handler. Then we go down here and it says the handler runs a request through a filter chain that is specific to that request. The reason the filters are divided by dots is that the filter can run logic both before and after the proxy request is sent. All pre-filter logic is executed. Once it's sent to the proxied service, then the proxy request is made. After the proxy request is made, the post-filter logic is run. So you can have pre and post filters. And again, that is kind of the idea with this. Hey, you call into the gateway, we call down to posts. We can manipulate the request from the gateway to post. We can manipulate the response from post back to the client, really. So that's how it works. How is it going to work? We can do this through the Spring Cloud Gateway configuration. This can be either in a application.properties or a YAML file, or there's a Java Fluent API config. Then I just have some kind of definitions here of what routes are, what predicates are, what filters are, and we're going to get into all of this as we go throughout the tutorial. So that's that. I think I just wanted to give an overview of why you might want to need it, what Spring Cloud Gateway is. Now what we're going to do is we'll jump over to start.spring.io. We'll create a gateway project, and then we'll talk about what that project needs to do to talk to our downstream backend services. So what are we waiting for? Let's write some code. All right, so we'll look at our two downstream services in a second, the posts and the comments, but we need to create the gateway. So we'll, just like any other project, we're going to head over to start.spring.io. I'm going to choose Maven. I'm going to choose the latest version of 3.2. I'm going to say dev.dan Vega. We'll call this a gateway demo, and this is Spring Cloud Gateway demo. And I'm going to choose Java 21. You don't have to. You can choose Java 17. I'm going to go ahead and pick a dependency. Now, what dependency do you need? Simply one. Go in here and look for Gateway, Spring Cloud Gateway. This gives you Spring Cloud routing, provides a simple yet effective way to route APIs to provide cross-cutting concerns such as security, monitoring, metrics, and resiliency. So with that in place, that's all you need. Go ahead and generate your project, unzip it, and we'll open it up in my favorite IDE, which is IntelliJ, but you can open it up in whatever IDE or text editor you're most productive in. With that, let's write some code. All right, so if you remember back to the diagram, I had some downstream services, the post service and the comment service, and that's what we're looking at now, just to kind of show you what those look like. Again, we've kind of covered these in previous videos, but just a quick overview. The post one has a controller or repository. We're using Spring Data JDBC. It reads from this post.json, which is the 100 list of posts that the JSON placeholder service gives you. And then finally, we're using this on port 8081, not to clash with the gateway's 8080 port. And then, yeah, I think that's really all that's interesting. It uses Docker Compose, has its own database. The comments is very similar. It runs on a different port 8082. So those are our two downstream services. Here's our gateway application that we just created at start.spring.io. We're going to create some routes, a way to go ahead and route traffic to our downstream services. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, we can do this using a Fluent Java API, so we can write Java code, or we can do this through configuration. So I'm going to start with configuration. I'll show you an example of the Java code, but mainly this is where I go ahead and configure this because we can take advantage of configuration changes later on, like if we need to externalize that configuration and maybe change it for different environments, we can do so. So I'm going to go ahead and say that this is a YAML file. It just makes it a little bit easier to configure. So now we need to set up some routes to our downstream services. How do we do that? So we're going to start with Spring Cloud Gateway routes. And then in here, we're going to create a route for every service that we need to route to. So the first thing that I do is give it an ID. I'm going to call this the post route. And then you need to give it a URI. So I could start with just hard coding this in. I could say, hey, that post route is located at localhost 8081 just 8081. So I could do that. But what I also want to do is go ahead and provide some environment variable here that we could change later on. So I'm going to say the posts route URI is located here. And then if you do that with a colon, that basically gives it a default value if one is not defined. So now it'll be localhost 8081. If we want to override that in a different environment, that's great. Now, let's talk about our post service. So let's go ahead and fire up our post service here. I want to run it and see if everything works okay. And if it does, I just want to make a request to it so we can see what's going on. So I'll go ahead and as this gets fired up, it's just... Okay, so that started. So I'm able to go into the terminal here. I'm going to use a command line tool called HTTP. So it's kind of like curl, but just a little bit more readable. If you don't have it installed, you can install it, or you can use something like curl. So I'm going to say, hey, 8081/API/posts. That's where I'm going to go. And if I do that, I'll get a list of 100 posts. I can go to a particular post and get that entry. I can go to one that doesn't exist and get a not found. So that's what's going on the post side. I want to filter. I basically want to forward requests onto that service. So we know that localhost 8081/API/posts is where we're going to send it, but we need to have some predicates. So a predicate is a way for us to kind of determine if this is a request that we're going to send down to that proxied service. So what I'm going to do is instead of /API/posts, I'm going to have simple routes on my gateway. So I'm going to say, hey, if somebody is calling the path/posts on the gateway, then I want to go ahead and send it down to my downstream service. So that is the path I'm trying to match on. If we match on this, then we can go ahead and send it downstream. But before we send it downstream, we can apply some filters to it. So this is a good place to go ahead and check out in the docs. There are a whole bunch of built-in filters. The one I'm going to use here is called prefix path. So I'm basically prefixing a path onto this route. All right, and then the filter that I want to use for this is called prefix path. And so I'm going to prefix the path with /API. So whenever you find something with /posts, we're going to forward it on down to our downstream service, which is located at localhost 8081. And I'm going to prefix the path /API onto it. Now, there are other filters that I can go ahead and add. And one of which is called the add response header. Now, there is a long form way of adding a filter that is built into Spring Cloud Gateway, and there is a short form. The long form is saying, what is the name of the filter? In this case, it is add response header. And then there are the args. And in the case of the response header, there's a name and a value. So I could say name is equal to x powered by. So this is just a response header that I'm adding. And then the value could be something like, dance on. Now, this is the long form of doing it. There's also a short form of adding a filter. In this case, it's the filter name. So I'm going to say add response header. So header is equal to x powered by, and then a comma, and then the value. So this is the name, this is the value, these are the arguments, and then this is the value. So the value is going to be dance on gateway service. All right. So that is our first route. We've defined a route called post route. We're going to send it down to localhost 8081. We're going to match on anything of /posts, and we're going to prefix it with API. If we didn't prefix it with API, this wouldn't work, right? Because we saw in the previous example, it's localhost 8081 /API/posts. So let's take a look at how we can go ahead and run this. Let's run this application. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. Again, this is going to run on 8080. Our post is on 8081. Our comments is on 8082. So if we go ahead and fire up terminal here, we're going to say HTTP on 8080/posts, and that should give us all of the posts. Now, again, in our configuration, we said we gave it this wildcard, which means we're going to forward any request. So we're going to forward the gets, the posts, the puts, the deletes. In this case, I'm just going to test out being able to grab a random one. And it looks like that works out as well. And you also notice here that we have added the response header. So X powered by, we have dance on gateway service. So we're manipulating the request and the response as we're forwarding this down to the downstream service. So that's a quick intro into kind of setting up the route here in application.yaml. Now we looked at predicates, we looked at filters. How did I know what filters were available to me in Spring Cloud Gateway? That's a good question. I'm glad you asked. Let's head back over to the browser. And this is another question I get a lot, like how do I find documentation on a particular product? The first place to start, always head over to spring.io, go into projects. In this case, this Spring Cloud Gateway falls under the Spring Cloud project. So if you go into Spring Cloud and then go to Spring Cloud Gateway, here is the Spring Cloud Gateway. We'll see an example of this, but this is the Java Fluent API for writing routes. We're doing it in configuration right now, but you can also do it in Java code. If you go into the Learn section and go into the reference documentation, this is where all of that information is. So if you want to find out about predicates, now predicates are, hey, what are we matching on? You can match on much more than the path. If you wanted to find out, hey, I want to match on a particular header or a cookie or a method or a path or a query param. These are all things that you could match on as a predicate. Then from a filter standpoint, what are all the filters involved? We saw the add response header one. So we went in, we added a response header. Here's the name of the header. Here's the value of the header. This can also be, you can use it in the long form. Speaking of which, how did I figure out what was long form and what was short form? You'll see in here that there is the shortcut configuration. So cookie equals the name of the cookie and then comma and then the value. You can also fully expand those. So this is where you can learn a little bit more about that. So we learned about predicates, we learned about filters, everything right here in the documentation. You can go into the Fluent Java API routes. And why don't we do that now? Why don't we go ahead and comment this out in here. So I'm going to say, let's get rid of this. And then I'm going to come into my main application here. I'm going to just paste some code in. We don't need to watch me write this together. And now I'm going to define two routes, one for posts and one for comments. So now if we go ahead and fire up this application again, we should be able to basically go to localhost 8080/posts or /comments. So I'm going to say /posts, and there's our posts. And then I'm going to also say comments. And that is not working. What is happening there? Did we forward? Oh, we don't have our comment service started. So we may want to do that. Let's go ahead and run this application. All right, now that that's running, let's try that again. And there's our comments. So you can see our gateway is now forwarding a request down to our downstream service. And in this case, we've set it up using the Java Fluent API. So we come in here, we create a bean, and this is going to take a route locator builder. I called it builder, and we're just building some routes. So here's route 1, and here's route 2, and then we build it and we return that. So in there, we're defining the predicate, which is the path, the filters, here's the URI. Everything that we do in the application.yaml file for configuration, we could do here in Java using the Fluent API. All right, so I think we're going to cover one more thing here that you'll find in the documentation, and that has to do with the actuator. I've talked about this in the past, but the Spring Boot Starter actuator is one of those starters that I think you should be including in every single project, and this is no exception because we can get to do some cool things here. One of which is there's a new gateway endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and paste in some configuration here. I'm just exposing all of the endpoints. I'm including details for health, and I'm going to enable the gateway endpoint. And this will allow downstream services to talk to this actuator and get some information about the routes that are configured in our application. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. And if everything starts up okay, we should be able to head over to the browser. And you'll notice all of the endpoints are here, including a new one for gateway, which will give you information about your routes. So while we're here, I just wanted to mention one more thing. That is Spring Cloud Gateway, the open source version. There's also a commercial version that you can get from VMware Tanzu, and it adds a lot of really great features on top of it. The biggest one, in my opinion, is single sign-on. So in a lot of organizations, you might need SSO on top of your applications, and then Spring Cloud Gateway can basically talk to SSO and log you into all of your different services. Besides that, it has a whole bunch of different features. Another one of my favorite is the Open API discovery. So basically, it can talk to all the downstream services and generate Open API specs, and then you can bring that into some documentation viewer like Swagger, so that a client could read that documentation about all the downstream services. So a bunch of really great features in Spring Cloud Gateway Commercial. If you're interested, go ahead and check that out. All right, I really hope you enjoyed that introduction to Spring Cloud Gateway, and I just want to let you know this is just the beginning of this story. We have a lot to cover when it comes to Spring Cloud Gateway. I threw out this on Twitter. I said, hey, I'm working with Spring Cloud Gateway. Do you have any questions about gateways in general and how to use them? If so, let me know. And you guys did not disappoint. I got a ton of really great questions. I think we answered a couple of them today, but as you can see, there's a lot of them, and we need to answer a lot of these questions. So I'm going to continue to put together content on this. And if I can't answer that directly in a video, I'll see if we can't just get a list of questions and put some answers to those and get those back out to the community. So I really appreciate the questions. I really hope you're enjoying some of this gateway content. If you have more questions that we didn't cover today or in this list of questions, let me know in the description below. We'll add it to that list and we'll see if we can't get to it. So, hey, I hope you learned something new today. If you did, do me a big favor, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, friends, happy coding.